We're now going to look at some recent trends in the history of animal behavior. Neuroethology is an interesting area, especially as technology has enabled us to do more than we've ever been able to do in the past. It's sort of like a marriage between neuroscience and the study of species-typical animal behavior. In other words, trying to account for some of the underlying neuronal mechanisms of species-typical behavior. What's going on in the brain? And here's a couple of examples. There have been studies looking at various brain nuclei. For those that don't have much of a neuroscience background, a nucleus in the brain is a group of cell bodies that are sort of clustered together that have some common function in terms of their involvement in controlling certain types of behaviors. So looking at different brain nuclei associated with species-typical perception and the production of species-typical vocalizations, things like that. Lots of studies in that area. Or outside the brain, but still internal to the organism, looking at various hormonal mechanisms of reproductive behavior. In another segment, I mentioned Daniel Lehrman, who's done a lot of that work on ringdoves, and there's been a lot done ever since then. So here's a couple examples of things that we could call neuroethology. I would. The PET scan is a device that shows you the function of the brain. So you're lying down in this scanner and you're being scanned and maybe thinking about something or listening to music or speaking. Simple tasks like that. There's not a whole lot you can do if you're lying in a scanner. You have to remain pretty still, in fact, perfectly still while you're being scanned. But then the areas of the brain that are more functional than other areas of the brain, based on whatever it is you happen to be doing, will be portrayed with brighter colors on a scanner. Here's an example of that.
Give her a PET scan.
All set.
So those yellows, the reds, these are areas of the brain that are more active than areas in blue. Certainly would be the less active in any particular point in time. Doesn't mean they're inactive, by the way. Your brain is always involved in everything. All areas of the brain are. It's just that some areas are involved more than others. Sort of goes back to Kuo's idea of his theory of behavioral gradients, but now applied to the brain. But the red areas, those are certainly more active than certainly the blue areas. The green areas sort of moderately active as well. So you can start to see where in the brain there's more involvement with controlling certain types of behaviors. So, for example, this has been done recently with crows. So a crow is being placed in a scanner, and of course it can't be anesthetized. It has to be watching something, in this case, looking at various types of visual stimuli while it's being scanned to see if there's different areas of the brain that are more active when different types of stimuli are being viewed by the crow. And so here's the results of one study. Different areas that are in fact more involved when different stimuli are being viewed by the crow. So if a crow is watching a person who has captured a crow, in other words, what a crow you would think to be somewhat anthropomorphic here would view as a threatening type of a visual display because the person's capturing a live crow, then the amygdala in the crow's brain becomes particularly active, which is interesting because the amygdala is hugely involved in the processing of emotions in all animals that have amygdala. The hippocampus is more involved if the person happens to be holding a dead crow. And another area, the caudal nidopallium, is more involved if the crow is simply watching a stuffed hawk and there's no person there at all. So different areas of the brain processing different types of stimuli. And then we have fMRI technology, functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, which also shows you brain function, but also sort of maps that on to a higher resolution image than a PET scan does. And again, it's just showing you what areas of the brain are more active. So again, you have to lie perfectly still in a scanner when you are being scanned. You can't be moving around. So you can imagine with an animal, wow, that has to be pretty difficult because you cannot anesthetize the animal. So this has been done recently with dogs. It's also been done with primates, non-human primates, by the way. But I kind of like these recent dog studies. They're pretty fascinating. The trick, of course, is to first train the dog to lie perfectly still with its head not moving around inside of this apparatus. And as you'll see, it's quite doable.
One of Greg's earliest experiments is revealing an important clue as to what happens in a dog's brain when it receives information from its senses. First, Katie is looking at a visual signal.
Katie's in the scanner right now, and Patricia's actually giving Katie hand signals. So we've already taught the dogs through lots of practice that this means food. Okay, so every time Patricia puts this signal up, we're going to be looking in her brain what that brain response is. And we're actually going to be looking at a very specific area called the caudate nucleus. We also have another hand signal that looks like this, and that means no reward.
After scanning many dogs, Greg's results reveal the area of the dog's brain that responds.
If we look very closely, we find that the area that's common to all the dogs corresponds exactly to the same part of the human brain that responds to reward. Rewards like money, music, food, all the things that humans like, it's also activating in the dog's brain.
Even though Katie isn't actually seeing food, she can take a piece of visual information and interpret it to anticipate that she will receive food, and she's responding emotionally, just like we do.
And this was pretty amazing because it didn't have to be that way. Dogs could be so different from us that they might have responded completely differently. But that doesn't seem to be the case.
And this reveals a complex chain of brain activity.
Ever since Pavlov, people have viewed animals as Pavlovian machines, stimulus response robots, basically. And what we're finding is that there's a tremendous amount of processing going on in their brains that looks actually a lot like what happens to humans in exactly the same circumstances. Dogs and probably most animals have brains and minds that are far more sophisticated than we ever gave them credit for.
Really interesting research. And of course, during the initial training trials, before the dog was ever put into the scanner, those hand signals would be associated with either food or non-food. So the dog learned when the palm went up that it was in fact going to be rewarded, and indeed it was rewarded. It's just that now in the scanner, it's only viewing the hand signals. So yeah, again, so the hand goes up and there's more activity in the caudate nucleus. It's abbreviated CD in the brain scan over on the right. And that's exactly what you would see in a human being. Okay, following up on that, here is yet another study also involving the fMRI in dogs.
Dogs have dedicated voice areas in their brains, just as people do. Voice area of the dog responds more strongly to dog sounds, and the voice area of the human brain responds more strongly to human sounds. Voice areas are located very similarly in the dog and human brain. This means that these areas evolved at least 100 million years ago, the age of the last common ancestor of humans and dogs. Dogs and humans use similar brain mechanisms to process social information. This is a first step to understand what makes vocal communication between dogs and humans so successful.
So, yeah, dogs and humans process sounds very similarly in terms of what areas of the brain are more active. Here's an interesting study involving fMRI and dogs in terms of recognizing familiar human odors, in other words, the pet owner. And again, what's important here is the caudate nucleus, which, as we saw moments ago, is hugely involved in rewarding types of events, rewarding experiences. So here are the data. Look what happens with a human. If it's smelling a familiar human, the pet owner, there is an increase in activity in the caudate nucleus. There is a decrease in activity in the caudate nucleus if it's smelling an unfamiliar human. Now, what about a dog? If it's smelling a familiar dog, yeah, you get a little bit of an increase in the caudate nucleus, nothing to write home about. But you still get a pretty good decrease if it's smelling an unfamiliar dog, and just a very, very slight, non-significant decrease if it's smelling itself. So the big effect here is if it smells a familiar human, there's much more activity in the caudate nucleus. So the odor of the pet owner is actually a very rewarding experience for the dog, as reflected by an increased activity in the caudate nucleus. Okay, another area that I would sort of classify as neuroethology is a relatively new technique called optogenetics. And what's being done with optogenetics is you take a light-sensitive protein, which you can get from algae actually. So you're going to insert that into a single neuron. I mean, you could insert it into a group of neurons, in other words, a nucleus. You could do that, or even just a single neuron, which makes this really exciting because you can just switch on a light because these are photosensitive, and then the neuron suddenly becomes active. And you can see with the light off down here, you have a mouse that is hugging the wall of this open space. In other words, they're a little bit afraid of exploring. But then you switch that neuron on by shining a light on it, and it starts exploring all over the place. So here's a study from optogenetics where you're taking, again, an optogenetically labeled neuron in the hippocampus, an area that's involved in many things, especially memory. And you're going to actually condition a fear response in a rat. Okay, so you're going to make it afraid of a loud noise, for example. So you're going to just condition that. And then you're going to allow the rat enough time to forget that that conditioning ever took place. In other words, it's not afraid of that stimulus anymore. So you might say, well, okay, so the memory's gone. There's no remnant of the memory left. Well, guess what? If you optogenetically stimulate the neuron, the conditioned fear returns. In other words, the memory is not gone, it's just kind of inactive. If you stimulate the neuron in the hippocampus, it suddenly returns. The fear response returns. So there is a trace of this memory, even though it doesn't manifest itself automatically. Well, just one more area I'm going to mention is behavioral ecology. There's been a lot of really interesting research coming out of this area. I'll give you an example of what we're looking at here. So the area as a whole incorporates evolutionary principles into organism-environment interactions. That's the term ecology, environment. And the environment also, of course, includes other individuals, not only of the same species, but also of other species, and how that would affect one's behavior. A lot of attention has been given to resource availability, and resources can be broadly defined to include almost anything. Optimal foraging studies, in other words, how might you best search for food while expending the least amount of energy so that you can then bring the food back and feed your offspring, for example, optimal foraging. Habitat selection, what are some of the factors that help you select one habitat over another? Habitats that might be more desirable versus habitats that might be not so desirable. Predation, a lot of work on predation in the area of behavioral ecology, as well as the relative costs and benefits of parental behavior in terms of maximizing fitness. Well, let's just quickly look at this last one, because it relates to yet another theory of R.A. Fisher, and this is his sex ratio theory. And basically, here's what the theory is indicating. If the cost of devoting parental resources to male offspring and female offspring is about equal, in other words, one sex is no more costly than the other, then what you would expect to see is parents will devote about equal amount of resources toward both sexes. One sex won't benefit more than the other. However, if one sex is more costly than the other, then you would see the parents devote more resources, bring more food back, for example, and feed the less costly individual than the more costly individual. And it's not just bringing back food, it's also physiological mechanisms that actually result in the production of more of the less costly sex than the more costly sex, which is really, really intriguing. And a good example of that comes from the Seychelles warbler. It's actually the first evidence of this kind of thing in birds. So, it turns out that there are behavioral differences between the sexes of the offspring. Daughters are what we call nest helpers. In other words, they hang around and help the parents rear the next brood. They'll bring food back to the nest and help drive off predators, all these kinds of things that the parents are also engaged in. The sons, on the other hand, don't do that. They disperse. Now, there's a relationship between this and territory quality. It turns out that, of course, on high-quality territories, and we define high quality here as territories that have that produce a lot of food. There's a lot to eat on these territories, which is why they're high territory. Then the daughters will actually increase their parental fitness because they're helping bring back all this food to the nest to feed the next brood of offspring. On low-quality territories, however, where there's less food, now the daughters are actually more costly. They'll actually decrease the parental fitness because they're going to be eating some of this food. And so on low-quality territories, you may not want so many daughters around because they are going to be hanging around. Remember, it's the sons that disperse. So with that in mind, what the researchers did in this study was to do a transplantation experiment. So what they did was they transplanted the birds from a low quality territory where there wasn't a whole lot of food available, transplanted them to a high quality territory, lots of food available. And when they did this, they found that the mothers were skewing the sex ratio toward the daughters. They were producing more daughters, producing more eggs that hatched into females rather than into males. Now, sex is determined by hormonal mechanisms in birds as it is in mammals. So, on a high-quality territory, they were in fact producing more daughters because daughters would be helping them more than sons. So sons are running off. They're not helping them in any given way. However, having too many daughters is not a good thing either. So if you have more than two helpers, more than two daughters on the same territory, that can be costly because they're going to be competing for some of these same resources that they're helping to feed the offspring. So it turns out that if there's more than two daughters on the territory, even though it's a high-quality territory, the moms will now start to produce more sons because the sons are less costly. The sons are going away. The daughters would be hanging out. And so they'll kind of wait as long as they're still in a high-quality territory for the number of existing daughters to mature and leave and start rearing their own offspring before they're going to switch back to produce more daughters. So in this case, too many daughters, more sons will be produced. And again, there are hormonal mechanisms triggered by brain mechanisms that are regulating this whole thing. So a good example of one of so many experiments that comes from the area of behavioral ecology. So those are just a couple examples of some of the current trends in animal behavior.